My name is Sina, as I mentioned. I've been with Cirrus for almost 5 years. I've spent the last decade advising doctors, healthcare tenants across both Canada as well as the U.S. And today's presentation is entitled Identifying $100,000 Traps in Your Veterinary Office Lease Agreement. Many of you have heard about this webinar through our different industry partners, including Henry Schein Animal Health, and we have representation on this webinar from doctors all across the U.S., Canada, as well as overseas. In terms of the agenda for today, before we get started, I'd like to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. So again, if you have your microphones on, please kindly mute those. The agenda for today, first and foremost, I'm going to give you a little bit of information with regards to why we're putting on this webinar, so you have an understanding of why the topic is so important and why we're taking time out of our day to discuss this idea of negotiating a lease agreement with a landlord. We're also going to discuss some alarming industry trends over the next 60 minutes or so, and discuss also what the lease agreement is and why it's so important. What are the common traps you'll find in your commercial lease agreement? Some of the key leasing considerations. Whether you're starting a practice or looking to buy or sell your current clinic, it's important to understand what determines the value of your business, and we'll discuss that for those of you that are thinking about transitioning. We're also going to speak about the tenant lease cycle. This is really a diagram and a concept that I've been teaching doctors over the last 4.5 years. It primarily has to do with timing your negotiation so that you're able to get the most outcome from the conversation you have and the negotiation you conduct with your landlord to get maximum results with regards to negotiating. And then we're also going to spend a bit of time discussing what I call the 7-step process for winning in a lease negotiation. If you're thinking about negotiating a lease agreement within the next couple of years, there is a process that we have followed internally, and we find that it works. We find that it's extremely effective in getting a better lease agreement when you're negotiating with a landlord, and I'll walk you through that 7-step process, and this is something that you can apply to your own lease negotiation if you have a lease coming up for renewal, or perhaps you're looking to start a clinic from scratch and you'd like to negotiate an offer with a prospective landlord. And last but not least, we will have the opportunity to take your questions towards the end of the webinar, and you're more than welcome to reach out to us at any time after today as well if you have follow-up questions as you're thinking about the topic of negotiating a lease agreement. So some interesting statistics that a lot of practitioners are not really aware of. Over 75% of veterinarians today have signed an agreement, a lease agreement, that can prevent them from transferring their lease agreement and selling their practice due to landlord interference. So there's a clause in every lease agreement that affects your ability to transfer that lease agreement to some other practitioner, and we'll spend a bit of time discussing that. The practitioners that engage in lease renewal discussions without understanding the complex lease provisions that appear in their agreement, that their landlord fully understands but they don't happen to have a full comprehension of, end up paying hundreds of thousands of dollars more in unnecessary rent increases over time. And so preventing yourself from overpaying in rent is absolutely critical when you're thinking about renewing a lease agreement. And healthcare practitioners are the least risky type of commercial tenant a landlord can have. So when you think about the type of tenant you are, number one, your business in comparison to your typical retail or office business has a low default rate. Also, healthcare tenants have a low bankruptcy rate. The healthcare industry continues to be more recession-proof than, say, retail stores and retail businesses that sell merchandise. Significant investment in leaseholds, and we know from our experience having worked with doctors over the last 21 years that when you build a clinic, you are spending a lot of money and time building that clinic. And because of that significant leasehold improvement that you make, you're less likely to relocate, whereas a convenience store owner, the nail salon owner, the owner of a restaurant would be more likely to relocate than a veterinary clinic. You also generate a lot of foot traffic, so that's a very good thing for a landlord because they realize that the service you provide is important service to the community. And as the population grows, so does the need for having veterinarians within the local community. And as such, the landlord understands that by having a clinic in their property, that does in turn drive beneficial traffic that may significantly benefit other co-tenants within the building that you're in, and also increase property values. Landlords love long-term lease agreements unless they're looking to demolish or redevelop a property, and because of that, it allows you to increase the value of their building, which in turn motivates them to want to negotiate with you. In terms of who we are as an organization, so we were founded by healthcare professionals back in 1994, and we analyze thousands of office leases each year. In fact, we currently analyze over 1,200 lease agreements on an annual basis. We've represented over 1,000 practitioners last year alone. These are individuals that not only are tenants, but also owner-occupiers, meaning they own the commercial property that they're located in. We have negotiated over 12,000 office leases over the last 2 decades. So we've been operating in North America and as well as the UK since 1994, and as a result of that, we've been able to successfully negotiate over 12,000 lease agreements, specifically for healthcare tenants. We also conduct over 150 educational seminars annually, and we also participate in various veterinary conferences. The last one I personally participated was the AVMA, and many of you will actually meet us at different conferences and hear us lecture at different organizations and study clubs. And we are today the #1 tenant representation firm for animal health practitioners in North America. There's nobody in North America who's negotiated more lease agreements than we have for veterinarians specifically. And we have worked across both Canada as well as the U.S. This is just a small sample size of the doctors we have represent, a combination of veterinarians. We even represent dentists. Many of you may not be aware that we do work with dentists, medical doctors, physicians, anybody who has a colleague in the healthcare industry and has a challenge negotiating a lease agreement. This is really what we do. This is all we do day in and day out. And as a result of that, we've been able to develop highly skilled staff to be able to handle a renewal for a doctor, to be able to negotiate a lease agreement for a startup location. So with that said, what is a lease agreement? And the easiest way I can describe a lease agreement to you is it's like a check. Now, the difference between the check that you write to the landlord is most doctors, when they're thinking about negotiating a lease agreement, they pay attention to rent. But what they don't really look at is everything else that comes attached with the lease. And by that I mean all the legal covenants that appear after typically the table of contents and the first few pages of the agreement. The first few pages of the lease agreement generally talk about the term, the rent, the square footage, and how much you're going to pay with regards to maintenance expenses or operating costs. And those are the basic financial terms that a lot of tenants and doctors pay attention to when they're negotiating a lease agreement. What they don't pay as much attention to is all the legal provisions in their agreement that are buried from page 5 to 45. And from that perspective, it's important to understand why the lease agreement, because it has a lot of legal covenants, is so important to you. Well, in the beginning of the presentation, we already talked about the fact that when you're building a practice, it's a significant investment in cost today to build a veterinary clinic. And because of that, the lease agreement is the foundation of your practice. If you think about the fact that if you were to move your practice 3, 4, 5 miles away, that would have an impact on you because you'd have to build from scratch. And more importantly, without a lease agreement, assuming you didn't have a lease agreement, you wouldn't have any predictability in the location. You could, for all you know, be kicked out of the building because the landlord has sold the property or the landlord has decided to redevelop it, or perhaps the landlord doesn't want a veterinary clinic in their shopping center or their particular plaza because they have other intentions. They want to bring by an anchor tenant or another tenant who they feel would be a more suitable fit for the type of tenant mix they're looking for. We already discussed the fact that it's very difficult to move a clinic. So if you have a clinic and you would like to move it, it's going to take you time. It's time consuming to actually move to a new location. You have to go through the process of getting the permits. You have to make sure that the space and the premises is zoned for building a clinic. You have to go through the design process, the construction process, and all of that is going to take you anywhere from as low as 4 months to as much as 12 plus months, depending on where you are. And it is very hard in our experience when we're working with veterinarians for them to identify a suitable location for their clinic. Because if you move too far away, you will have attrition of clients. And that will also have an impact on your gross production. Your gross production will be negatively impacted not only by you moving too far away, but also by you being in a situation where you are forced to be shut down for a period of time while that new space is being constructed. So the lease is really the glue that holds everything together. And the benefits of a properly negotiated lease agreement are multidimensional. The two things that you want in the lease agreement are fair and affordable financial terms and long-term stability and security. By fair and affordable financial terms, what I'm really referring to is ideally a 10-year lease, so at one 10-year term, plus 2 or 3 options to renew the lease agreement for periods of 5 years each, therefore giving you a total of 20 to 25 years of predictability. And most doctors that are thinking about their career, they're thinking over the next 2 decades or more. And from that perspective, long-term lease agreement does make sense because it allows you to have some stability, unless you're willing to relocate because you no longer like the location that you're in. If that's the case and you have a lease today and your lease is coming up for renewal, you may not necessarily agree to a 10-year lease. Maybe you'll do a 2, 3, 4, 5-year term to have the flexibility to move. But for most of our clients, what we find is a 10-year lease makes sense because they're not looking to pick up their practice and relocate it. And on the notion of having fair and affordable financial terms, in most states, if you're looking for a space today, if you are in a space in a lease agreement, you're paying a base rent, and you're also paying for the additional charges that the landlord accrues, and those charges relate to the common area maintenance. They relate to taxes, property taxes, and insurance. So if you have a lease agreement, you want to pay attention to not only is my base rental rate fair, but also am I overpaying? Is my common area maintenance going up year over year by 10, 15, 20%, and is that sustainable in the long term? And the most common type of lease agreement today is a triple net lease, where the tenant pays a base rental rate, and they also pay for their proportionate share of operating expenses and maintenance. And if the landlord decides to replace the HVAC, the heating and ventilation system, who covers the cost of that? Is that well defined in your lease agreement? What does your lease say with regards to those expenses? So identifying not only the base rent, but also the additional rental rate, the additional rent that is going to be added on top of your base rent is very important in getting a fair lease agreement. Some of you may have a gross lease, meaning you may be paying your landlord a lump sum amount of rent, and regardless of what happens with maintenance of the property, or if property taxes go up, your rental rate doesn't change because you've already pre-negotiated that rent with the landlord. If you have a gross lease agreement, you're probably the exception because most tenants across the U.S. today, as well as Canada, have a triple net lease or modified net lease agreement where they are paying for their proportionate share of those operating costs. You should also want to minimize your risk and exposure in a lease agreement. So when you're signing a lease agreement, I find too many of the doctors that we work with prior to us negotiating a lease agreement, when I look at the current lease, they've signed it personally. And what that means is that they and their business is not separate, right? When you think about signing a lease agreement, ask yourself the question, am I going to want to be personally liable for the payment of this rent and the performance of all the obligations in the lease? Most doctors wouldn't want to be personally liable. So if that's the case, ideally your lease agreement is set up in such a way that the corporation that is your business is listed as the tenant. And if you are looking to start a clinic, the landlord, regardless of having a corporation under the lease agreement, may ask you for what's called a personal guarantee. They may want you to personally guarantee that you're going to pay the rent. And if that's the case, ideally you say no. But if the landlord insists on a personal guarantee because you don't have any prior relationship or history in the building, what I would do is I would ask for a limitation of that guarantee to a certain duration of time and a certain dollar amount so that you're not on the hook yourself personally for the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And you also want to maximize your flexibility. What happens if you decided to sell the clinic? You want to now assign your lease. Is that built into your agreement? Do you have the right to expand? You know, if you need more space, Are you going to be forced to move out of the current building you're in and take on another property because of the fact that you don't have the right to expand? Or when the space does become available, another tenant comes up and picks up that location or that unit, and the landlord decides to give it to them. Or alternatively, the landlord may say, doctor, you've been a great tenant. We'll offer you that additional 1,000 square feet that you need, but the rental rate is going to be $34 per annum, and your current rent happens to be $28. And there's a huge discrepancy now between what you're paying in your current space and how much rent the landlord wants for the new premises that's adjacent to yours. You also want to enhance your ability, as I mentioned earlier, to sell the practice. Too many doctors don't understand the right mechanism for transferring or lease. I had a doctor earlier today thinking about transitioning, and she contacted the landlord and asked the landlord, how do I transfer my agreement to the buyer of my clinic? The landlord was asking her for personal income statements regarding this particular buyer. They asked for a copy of the purchase and sale agreement, as I saw in the email correspondence. In addition to, they were looking for the gross production of the clinic because they're determining how much is this business really selling for and what is being sold. Is it just the equipment? Is it the patient charts, the goodwill, or is it the leasehold improvements, which the landlord legally owns? So I'd like to now discuss what is in the lease agreement. We spent a little bit of time discussing why the lease is important, but I'd like to help you understand now how is it that the lease agreement is structured the way it is, and what can you do to negotiate the existing terms? And the first provision I'd like to discuss, and this will resonate with a lot of you that are current tenants, if you have a lease agreement, or if you're thinking about starting a clinic or buying a clinic, ask yourself, is there an option to renew in my offer to lease, or the assignment agreement if I'm taking over another practitioner's office? The option to renew, for definition purposes, is the right for the tenant to renew the lease agreement for a certain duration of time. Usually it's 5 years, but there are doctors that have an option to renew that maybe for 7 years or maybe for 3 years. It depends on what the landlord wants to grant at the time the lease is negotiated. And the option to renew example you see on your screen, this type of option to renew is found in approximately 90% of leases that we review. This example was taken directly from one of our clients' leases. For the purpose of confidentiality, we actually changed the name of the tenant. That's the only thing we changed, and replaced it with that of Dr. Joe Black. And if this type of provision is in your agreement, what it usually says is that if you decide to assign the lease or transfer the lease agreement, the option becomes null and void. This is what is meant by provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. What this means is that if you transfer the agreement to somebody else, the buyer doesn't have the right to exercise the option to renew. They'll have to go to the landlord and obtain or renegotiate the term of the agreement. And when they do that, they're not going to be offered a fair rental rate, because the buyer of the clinic who is already buying your practice, going to the landlord, doesn't have an existing relationship with the landlord. And that's going to put them in a bad position, because the landlord can offer any rental rate they like, knowing that the doctor doesn't have an option. And if they don't buy the practice and you continue to practice in the location, this whole trigger of an assignment may actually result in a default. In some lease agreements, it states that if you notify the landlord to transfer your lease agreement, instead of agreeing to a transfer, the landlord has the right to terminate the lease. And the reason why they like to do that is because they want to list the space on the market, see what kind of rental rates they can get for it, and then come back to you and say, hey, doctor, we want to assign the lease. Or alternatively, no, we don't agree to an assignment. Why? Because we found another practitioner who's willing to take over the space and pay us a higher rental rate because it's already improved as a veterinary clinic. The second section of this option to renew provision states that if the tenant has duly and regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default. So anytime you see the word default in a lease agreement and the first letter is capitalized, what it means is that that particular word is somewhere defined in the lease. In most lease agreements, there are set operating hours, so you can be open from, say, 9 o'clock to 6 p.m. You have to be open for a certain number of days. If you're not open for more than, say, 5 consecutive days, the landlord may actually hold you in default. So contrary to what most doctors believe, the number one reason why doctors default is not related to rent. It's all the other things in the lease agreement, the default provisions that the landlord's attorney has built in so that when they want to, they can hold you in default. Why? Because they may want to break the lease because they're looking to sell the property or sell it to a redeveloper. They may want to have the right to renegotiate the rent. So default provisions are typically designed to be very sensitive and ensure that there is an opportunity for the landlord to hold the tenant in default if they want to. And the lease agreement has to specify whether or not the landlord needs to notify you. The landlord legally doesn't have to notify you of a default if the lease doesn't say so. Furthermore, any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard firm lease. So you contact the landlord, you have an option to renew, and the landlord says, great, doctor, you've exercised your option to renew. Because of the way your lease is written, I get to now present you with my latest and greatest lease agreement. So when that happens, everything you've negotiated previously can evaporate. The landlord's current lease agreement is going to be worse for you than it was 10 years ago. The only reason why landlords spend money on legal fees to change their lease is to make it more flexible for themselves and shift the liability to their tenants. So if you're being asked to sign a standard firm lease agreement during renewal time, that's a problem. If you have this clause in your agreement, the notion of the renewal being based on a standard firm lease, that should be removed ideally prior to you exercising the option. And let's assume that the landlord allows you to renew the lease because you have an option to renew. This particular example states that in no event shall, meaning the rental rate, be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term, meaning if your rental rate today is $19 per square foot per annum, upon renewal time, you can't argue with the landlord you deserve a rent reduction because the way your option was structured, it said if you exercise the option, in no event will your rental rate be less than what it was in the previous month. So for those of you that think you're overpaying in rent, do not exercise your option to renew, because if you exercise it, in most cases, you don't have the leverage to go to the landlord and ask for a rent reduction. What we do is we actually contact the landlord before the option to renew deadline, and we say to the landlord, we don't like our existing lease agreement, we'd like to renegotiate the terms, and part of what we want to negotiate with you is the rental rate for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And then if you end up renewing the lease, many lease agreements state that the rental rate shall be based on renewing tenants in the building. So if you happen to have an anchor tenant in your building and they renew the lease agreement for $2 more a square foot per annum, guess what? Your rental rate is now tied to their rent because their rent set precedent, and because of the fact that your rent is based on other renewing tenants, you may find yourself in a situation where you're being compared to a national franchise, a Starbucks, a company that can actually afford to pay more rent because they've had a stellar financial quarter or year, and that allows them to pay a higher rent, whereas your rental rate shouldn't be higher because of the fact that your production has been flat or going down over the last 2 to 3 years. The second provision I'd like to discuss and bring to your attention is what's called assignment. So assignment and subletting in some lease agreements, or transfer as they call it, is found in approximately 75% of lease agreements. If you have an assignment clause in your lease agreement, it may be worded similar to the one you see here, because this is, again, taken directly from one of our clients' lease agreements prior to us negotiating it with the landlord. And what the assignment clause says is that if you want to assign the lease, if you want to transfer your lease agreement, you have to obtain the landlord's consent. You have to obtain the landlord's permission. There's not a single lease agreement I've reviewed, and believe me, I've reviewed thousands, that has stated that you have the right to transfer the lease without the landlord's consent. So if you need the landlord's permission, the landlord has to give you the permission to transfer your lease as part of a practice sale. And this particular example states, if you recall earlier, I mentioned the notion that some landlords have the right to terminate the agreement if you request an assignment. In this case, the landlord can actually turn around and say, thank you very much for the notice. As per the assignment section of your lease, we have the right, now that you've notified us to assign the lease, we have the right to either terminate your agreement or alternatively to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to be the greater of the then current market rent for the premises or 15% greater, whichever is higher. So if the market rental rates have gone up 17% because you negotiated your lease agreement in 2009 or 2010, when the economy was still recovering, if at that point in time the lower rental rates were justified and today the rent has gone up, you're going to pay the higher of either the average asking rental rates or 15% greater rent, whichever is higher at the time. So with regards to that, it's not good to have this sort of provision in the agreement because it allows the landlord to get rich off of your transition. The landlord here is saying, I'll agree to the transfer so long as I, the landlord, get to revise or renegotiate the rent to be higher than what it was previously. And most landlords, knowing that you're looking at transition, would like to revise the rent because it may have been years since they negotiated it, and the market is very different today than it was in 2007, 2008, and 2009. And let's assume that you are successful in transferring your lease agreement to another doctor. What happens in a lot of leases is it states that notwithstanding the landlord's consent, meaning if the landlord gives you permission to transfer the lease, you as the original tenant will not be relieved of liability, and you'll remain liable for any failure of the tenant, meaning if the buyer of your clinic doesn't pay the rent or defaults on any section of the lease agreement, the landlord can hold them in default, and they can also come after you. So if they've not been paying rent for the last 6 months, if the landlord cannot successfully get them to pay the rent, they can ask you to make them whole and make this payment. And this is one of the ways that the landlord ensures that if they approve the assignment, and they shouldn't have approved it because the buyer of your practice was not going to be a good tenant, they have the ability to not put themselves in a situation of financial loss. They can always come back to you and ask you to pay the outstanding rent that's due because you're the one who transferred the lease agreement to this particular practitioner. There are hundreds of other traps within the lease agreement. We won't have time for today's presentation to go through all of them. The one I want to talk about is what's called death and disability. Death and disability is a provision that you will hardly find in the lease agreement if it's drafted by the landlord. What it says is that if you as the owner of the clinic were to become disabled or you could not practice your profession, you have, as the owner of the clinic, you have the right to terminate your agreement by providing the landlord with advance notice. That advance notice is usually 6 months in advance. Now, there are doctors that we work with that are at the later stages of their career, and they're hesitant to sign a 5 or 10-year renewal because they're not sure whether or not their health is going to hold up. Or maybe they are not 100% certain if they can sell the clinic because the production hasn't, been doing well. And from that perspective, having this death and disability clause is critical because what it allows you to do is continue practicing your profession until you can, if your health holds up, and if something happens, you have the ability to back out of the lease. Just because there's a 10-year term, it doesn't mean that you're going to be obligated, if you have a death and disability clause, to pay rent until the end of the term. If you become ill and have to be hospitalized in year 6 of 10, you can turn around and terminate the agreement and only pay 6 months worth of rent, and you're out of there. You can move on. And this provision is very important for doctors that are thinking about their long-term health and their long-term future. Having this in the agreement makes it a lot easier to sign a 10-year lease. And landlords, if you recall, like long-term tenants. If they're not looking to redevelop the property, having a 10-year lease agreement gives you leverage to negotiate a better rental rate than a tenant who's only willing to sign a 1, 2, or 3-year agreement. I want to summarize some of the key components because there's a number of doctors that emailed us earlier prior to the start of the webinar, and we're primarily interested in knowing what are the key components I need to pay attention to if I'm looking to start up a clinic. The first one is rental rates. So making sure that you have fair and affordable rental rates is critical. Look at the market, determine what the going rates are, and make sure you're not paying or overpaying in rent. Another one is tenant improvements, making sure that you have negotiated with the landlord the right amount of improvements is important. And tenant improvements means that the landlord is contributing financially to the cost of the leasehold estate and the build-out of the clinic. You should also ask the landlord for a fixturing period, sufficient fixturing period, meaning a time period in which you're not paying any base rent. You can install your trade fixtures and construct the office without having to incur the liability to pay the rent to the landlord immediately. In addition to fixturing period, we also ask the landlord for a rent-free period. That can range anywhere from 3 months to 6 months, depending on the length of the term of the lease you're willing to commit to. And what the free rent period is really an inducement. It's to basically say to the landlord, because we're going to sign a 5-year lease or 10-year lease agreement, we believe that we should be given several months of free rent. Why? Because we're not the type of business that can get up and running 30 days after we decide we're going to locate our clinic here. It's going to take us time to build out the clinic, and that requires us to have a lease agreement that doesn't put us in heavy deficit within the first 12 months. And then you want to have the right legal clauses. And then we talked about assignment and options to renew. Those are just two components of having a good, strong lease. Other provisions in the lease agreement that are critical in having negotiated when you're thinking about starting a practice are things like the right to be able to assign. We already talked about that. But most importantly, the right to be able to, if you wanted to actually move out of the building. If the landlord decides to redevelop the property and they have a demolition clause in the agreement and they ask you to move out, are you able to get enough notice from the landlord if that clause is in your lease, or are they going to ask you to move out within 30 days? And as far as selling a clinic, you want to have lots of terms. So today, the average veterinarian needs at least 7 years of term, if not more, because when the buyer of the business goes to the bank to borrow money to obtain what's called a practice loan, they're going to need to have sufficient term. The banks want to amortize the loan over a certain duration of time, and the longer the term, the easier it is for the buyer to repay the debt. So if you have a lease that's coming up for renewal, say in the next 2 to 3 years, and you have an option to renew, the first thing you want to identify is whether or not that option can be automatically assigned if the landlord approves the transfer of the lease. And number two, you want to make sure that that option is lengthy enough. So if the option is only for 1 year and your lease comes up, say, for a renewal in 2 years, that only gives you 3 years of remaining term. And if you're looking to sell your practice next year, that's not going to be sufficient for the buyer to be able to finance the deal. So having lots of term is important. Having options to renew is critical in making sure that you have the ability as a buyer to be able to continue practicing dentistry in the location. And personal guarantees is interesting because too many doctors that are looking to transition have a lease agreement that they signed 10, 15, 20 plus years ago, and at the time that they built the clinic, the landlord said you have no history, you're in debt, your credit score isn't as high as it could be, so we want a personal guarantee. Years later, you've built a $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 business, maybe $1 million plus business, and you still have a personal guarantee in the agreement. And your lease says you have to, upon assignment, remain liable. So you're now exposing your personal assets to the landlord. And so if you have a personal guarantee, ideally, if you're thinking about selling the practice, you get the landlord to remove the guarantee from the agreement. And for those of you that are considering buying a clinic, you want to make sure that you don't give a guarantee that never expires, that's in place for the entire duration of time you're practicing in the location. And earlier on, I discussed the notion of the tenant lease cycle. So in my introduction, I discussed why it's important to time your negotiation. And this really applies to existing tenants. If you have a lease agreement today, the worst thing you could do is wait until your option to renew deadline, or even worse, wait until your lease agreement is close to expiry. There's 30 days or less until that lease term ends. Most landlords want to delay negotiating the lease agreement until the tenant has less than 6 months of remaining term. In fact, there's a reason why your deadline to exercise an option to renew is generally not more than 12 months in advance. It's usually 6 months to 9 months to 12 months, depending on the type of lease. Prior to the expiry of the term is when you can exercise an option. And what happens is you notify the landlord that you're exercising the option to renew your lease, and the landlord takes a couple of weeks, if not a couple of months, to propose or negotiate the rental rates with you. And what usually happens with a lot of doctors is they don't agree with the rental rate during renewal time, and unfortunately, because the shot clocks run out, they don't have the ability to go out there and look for another property if the landlord is bumping up the rental rate by 40%, right? The landlord has leverage. If your lease agreement expires in under a year, they have tremendous leverage. What we recommend to all of our clients is to start the negotiation process at least 24 months in advance. Why? Because if the negotiation takes a year, you have another year to put together a contingency plan in the event the landlord has other plans for the building or doesn't want to renew your lease or wants to renew it, but they want to obtain a much higher rental rate than you've been paying historically. And if you're attending the webinar today and your lease does come up for expiry in less than 2 years, it's critical that you come up with the right treatment plan to be able to address not only the rent, but also all the legal provisions that will need to be changed. Most attorneys that review a lease agreement, unfortunately for veterinarians, look at the lease agreement the same way they would look at a retail lease. And there's a lot of clauses in retail lease agreements that shouldn't be in a healthcare tenant's lease. Why? Because they don't apply to you. And your business, because it's not portable, having a relocation clause or demolition clause can be the difference between being able to practice until the end of your career or being forced to retire early because the landlord has exercised their right to relocate you or to demolish the property and you're out of a location and have to build from scratch, and perhaps you don't have the money or the ability to secure financing for that relocation project. And I promised you in my introduction that I was going to discuss the 7-step process for negotiating lease agreements. The first step that we follow when we're negotiating a lease is we get the right documents. Many doctors that have tried to negotiate the lease agreement will call up a landlord and will start negotiating the rent and the term without even looking at an executed copy of the agreement that's been countersigned essentially by the landlord. Earlier today I had a doctor who sent me a lease agreement and had already contacted their landlord and started negotiating the lease. I looked at the lease and there was no signature of the doctor and no signature by the landlord. And so what is there to justify the fact that this lease agreement has actually been enforced? What if the landlord has a different copy of the lease and their version is much different than one that the doctor's looking at? What are you negotiating? The second step after we obtain a copy of the lease agreement is to ensure that we are highlighting all the risks. So we want to go through the lease agreement and we want to identify the rental rate, we want to identify the term, the square footage, the tenant's proportionate share of operating expenses if you're in a triple net lease agreement. We want to define, what the base year is for operating expense calculations. And we want to go through the agreement and highlight the assignment clause, the provision that allows us to renew the lease. So all the clauses I discussed, plus many more, have to be identified during the review process. And once you've identified those provisions in your agreement, you want to start doing a bit of market research on rental rates and vacancy rates. What is the vacancy rate in your building? Is it 10%, 20%? Having a high vacancy rate does change your negotiation strategy, because if you're in a building that is 100% occupied, if you go to your landlord and say to the landlord, I want a 25% rent deduction, the landlord probably is not going to give that to you, especially if your lease agreement expires in less than 12 months. So when you're thinking about negotiating a lease, think about how much leverage you have and also what the economy dictates. If you're in a location where the building's deteriorated, it's really old, there's a property going up across the street or 2 blocks away that's brand new, offering a lower rental rate to new tenants, then you have more leverage. You can utilize that to your advantage when you're negotiating. And if you start the process 2 years in advance, the landlord is going to realize if they don't give you a fair deal, you have sufficient time to relocate. Maybe even buy your own building if that's what you want to do. And only after doing research on rental rates and vacancy rates will we start to prioritize what we're going to ask for. So what we generally do is we go through the list of the things that are in our lease, we define what changes we need, and we start prioritizing what we're going to ask for. Because if you call the landlord or send an email to the landlord with a laundry list of changes, the landlord probably is not going to respond really well to that, right? Most landlords care about term and rent. So what we try and do is we try to first negotiate the term of the lease, get to a consensus on how much term our client is willing to commit to, and after that, we also discuss the rent. What is going to be the rental rate, say, on a 10-year deal? How's it going to be structured? Is it going to be flat rent? Are there going to be 2 or 3% bumps along the way? And so what happens when the doctor renews the lease? So these things have to be first negotiated, and the landlord is more motivated to negotiate those items than they are the legal clauses in your agreement. Once the conversation about rent is out of the way, it's a lot easier to negotiate the legal terms of your agreement. You can go to the landlord now and say, hey, I noticed there's a relocation clause in my lease. Or, when I'm looking at the assignment provision, I notice that you have the right to terminate. That's not good for me because the way I sell my business is I transfer my lease agreement as part of the sale of the asset. I have to transfer my equipment, my charts, and my lease. So then it's a lot easier to negotiate these things. Why? Because the landlord's already gotten what they want, which is a commitment for you that you're going to stay in the building for the foreseeable future, and you're going to pay a fair rental rate going forward. And so the legal provisions, if you're negotiating those with the landlord, you want to make sure that you're the one who is drafting with the help of an attorney the language. So when you're submitting that information to the landlord, you're not writing in plain English, you're actually properly formatting that language so that the landlord can take that language and put it right in the lease agreement. You're amending the landlord's standard form lease with terms and provisions that are going to be enforceable and understood by both parties. After we've negotiated the legal terms, we then want to obtain a final copy of the lease. Once you obtain a copy of the lease agreement, please don't sign it immediately, okay? When you get a copy, a final copy, you've spent the last 6 months negotiating back and forth with your landlord. Once you get a final copy of the agreement, you want to go through it. You want to make sure that all the changes that you had discussed and brought to your landlord's attention have actually been addressed in your agreement. Almost half the time when we get a final copy of a lease with a landlord who we've been negotiating for on behalf of a client, when we go through that document, we notice there's things that are missing or have been added, okay? It's very common for a landlord to remove a clause from one section and try and reinsert it into a different section of the agreement. So make sure you're re-reviewing the agreement prior to signing it, and once you sign it, getting a final copy is critical, right? Don't just send it to the landlord with your signature on it. Make sure that the landlord sends you back a signed copy. You have it somewhere safe. And if something happens with the building, let's say there's a flood or fire, you have the ability to now file an insurance claim. Why? Because you've been keeping your lease agreement in a safe place. You can submit that to an insurance company, and if your business is down, they're going to be able to process your claim. In addition to that, the reason why it's important to have an executed copy of the lease is in the event of a dispute, if the landlord says, no, doctor, you're responsible for the maintenance of the heating and ventilation system, if your lease agreement is not signed, how do you know what you agree to? What if I told you that the lease agreement you have in your office or at home is not the right final copy? It's a draft copy. It happens all the time. I see clients looking at a lease agreement and they don't realize that the version they're looking at is not the same version that they ended up signing or the landlord signed. So to summarize today's presentation, the details in your lease agreement can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars if left alone. It's not just about rent. So rent is very important when we're negotiating a lease agreement, but it's not the only thing that you need to negotiate. It's really ensuring that you're minimizing your risk, maximizing your flexibility as a practice owner, and really increasing practice value so that you achieve long-term peace of mind. You also want to be strategic. Some doctors are under the impression because I'm a tenant and I'm leasing less than 2,500 square feet, how much leverage do I have, with the landlord? I'm just one tenant. This landlord is a multi-million or billion-dollar company. Why would they care to negotiate these things with me? And the reality is you do have leverage because every landlord wants to make sure their buildings are fully occupied. And so have you move out of the building, when there's 2 years or more remaining term, you have the proper ability to do the research to relocate. The landlord doesn't like that. They want to make sure that they have you committed long term. And so starting the process early is what gives you leverage, and you want to do your homework, right? Prior to picking up the phone and calling the landlord, get an idea what's going on in that landlord's organization. We have a lot of research that we conduct to see what's going on, and we hear about layoffs at certain companies, real estate companies. We hear of other companies that are acquiring assets left, right, and center. And so having that information is really beneficial because it allows us to position ourselves properly to negotiate and to motivate the landlord to give us the changes that we're looking for. And with that, I'd like to open it up now for Q&A. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually open up the chat window here. And there's a couple of things on your screen you're going to see. The first thing you're going to see is a survey. We're curious to know how you heard about this webinar and also whether or not you're looking to start a practice. Maybe you're looking to buy, build, transition. Maybe you're looking to renew the lease agreement. So this always gives me good feedback because it allows me to understand who on this webinar finds the information useful and how we can help you going forward. So interesting enough, so far, almost 35% of you are looking to transition, and then the other 26% or so are looking to relocate or expand. So I'm actually glad to see that many of you are in the position that would require an expansion because you're doing well. It sounds like you're outgrowing your space. That's always a good problem to have. But as many of you are also looking to transition, which is quite interesting. And then there's about 12% of you that are looking to renegotiate your existing lease just because it's coming up for renewal. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to utilize the chat Q&A window, which is located on the top right-hand corner of your screen. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a number of white papers we have, expansion guides. So for those of you that said you're expanding or relocating, that document may be very beneficial for you. We have a guide for buying a practice, renewing a lease, a relocation guide for any of you who are looking to relocate your clinic and are looking for a space. That guide will identify the proper steps you need to take to be able to do a successful relocation. And I'm noticing a couple of people are starting to type in here some questions, so I'll just wait for those to pop up. So I have a question here. I won't mention the name because I'm not sure if the person is comfortable with me mentioning their name. But it says, can a tenant who has not signed a personal guarantee break the lease and file bankruptcy to get out of further obligation? So you could, but what usually happens is if you have your corporate tenant declare bankruptcy, so if you have a corporation and it's a tenant under the lease agreement, if that corporation declares bankruptcy and you don't have a personal guarantee, yes, you could get out of your agreement, meaning you not be personally liable. So that is possible. But I'd like to have a look at your lease agreement so that I can make sure there's no guarantee. And also, I want to look at the assignment section because under the assignment section, there's usually some language talking about what happens if there is a bankruptcy, and whether or not the landlord, if you have, say, 2 years of remaining term or whatever the term is remaining on your lease and you're trying to break the lease, whether or not upon bankruptcy the landlord has the right to put a lien on your equipment, put a lien on your assets. So for this particular question, I'd like to take it offline because there's a number of moving parts, and I'd like to make sure I fully understand, Doctor, what you'd like to do going forward. I have another question here. Moving to a new space next to another clinic, and we'll be subleasing from that clinic owner for the first 4 years with a fixed rent, and then renegotiating with the landlord in 2020. What can I do to protect myself in this situation? So if you're planning on subleasing, for those of you considering subleasing, the sublease agreement requires the landlord's permission, meaning the head tenant has to provide permission. Sorry, the head tenant has to approach the landlord for permission to sublease. So the first thing we try to look at is the terms of the head lease agreement, and then we determine whether or not, based on the terms of the head lease, this tenant can actually sublease the space, and the term of the sublease matches the term of the head lease. So for example, if the head tenant only has 5 years remaining term, they can sign a 10-year sublease with you because they don't have that much security. So that's one of the things we look at. The other thing we look at, frankly, is making sure that if the head tenant is paying a particular rental rate, they're not charging you more than the rent they're paying to the landlord. Many tenants that are thinking about subleasing their space want to charge you as a subtenant a higher rental rate than what they're paying so that you're paying a greater percentage of their total rent. So it depends on how much square footage you're occupying, doctor. But again, another one of those questions that there's a lot of moving parts to, so I'd love to take that one offline as well to further address it. And then another question here is if the landlord has been in default, interesting, of the lease, and I, the tenant, state that in a legal way I can essentially sue him, can the landlord turn around and evict the tenant because there's no enforced lease in effect? So I have to ask you a couple more questions, Doctor, on that one, but generally speaking, the default section of the lease agreement, it's usually hard to hold a landlord in default because landlords are very good at writing default provisions that are very elaborate with regards to a tenant default, but not as much difficult for them to hold themselves, or have you hold them in default. So that one is a question that's interesting because I don't know what type of default you're referring to, but again, if you want to maybe follow up with me after the webinar, I can discuss that with you one-on-one. Is there a rule of thumb? I have another question here. Is there a rule of thumb for percentage of practice gross income that rental expenses should not exceed? Great question, Doctor. It depends on the type of building you're in. So if you're in, for example, a very busy strip plaza or shopping center, you can expect your rental rate to be higher as a percentage of your gross income. But usually I find that most of the clients we work with, their overhead as a percentage of their gross income, so specifically the rental rate as a percentage of their gross income, generally doesn't exceed more than 12%. We've seen a range of anywhere between 4% on the low end to as much as 12% on the high end. But there are plenty of doctors, believe me, that are paying much higher than that because either their rental rate is too high or their production is below average. And then I'm going to take one last question here. And for those of you, if I don't address your question, given the number of questions that are coming on the screen, I do apologize. I will make sure that you have the opportunity to follow up with me one-on-one. I'm at the final part of my lease negotiation in a 3,200 square foot space. This is the comment here, located in a new shopping plaza. There's only one entrance, and the landlord was to be responsible for the rear egress hallway to outside building in terms of the build-out, and it was not to be considered rentable square feet. Now, at the last second, they have added the extra 197 square feet to my rentable space. Do I have any position to challenge this if they specified that I was not responsible for this in the LOI? Wow, what a great and profound question. So what happens when you sign a letter of intent, Doctor, is if the letter of intent is non-binding, and it usually is, unfortunately, whatever stands in the lease is what's enforced. So if your letter of intent stated that the landlord wasn't going to charge for the 197 square feet of extra space, and in the lease agreement it's not reflecting that, chances are the lease is going to supersede. So let me have a look at your lease agreement. Let me have a look at the LOI. But unfortunately, I think the landlord had got you here, and it looks like there's not much that you have in the way of saying to the landlord, I'm not going to pay for the additional square footage. But again, we don't want to jump to conclusions. The first thing I do is get a copy of your LOI, your letter of intent, and the lease agreement, and review it to make sure that we don't miss out on any critical items. And last but not least, I said I'll take one final question, but there's so many questions that I'll address later on, but I'll take this one because it's interesting. I have an attorney who does mostly veterinary office leases. What advantage is there to work with your group if I have an attorney and I've already had a space chosen? So, Doctor, I think it's good for you if you're looking for help on the lease. If you want a second opinion, here's what I'm going to do. For any doctor who's attending tonight and would like to take advantage of having us review the lease agreement, we have some industry partners that provide a tremendous amount of financial support to our organization to do what we do, which is basically spread the message of a properly negotiated lease to every veterinarian across the country. And if you want to take advantage of a lease review and consultation, what I'm going to do is for the first 5 individuals that reach out to me and want to have their lease reviewed, what I'm going to do is I'm going to waive the fee for the first 5 attendees that reach out to me for the lease review. And we charge, and the comment here was, what's the difference between my attorney and your group? If you, doctor, want a second opinion on your lease, if you're one of the first people that contacts me, we'll give you that second opinion. And we won't actually charge you for the lease review. And then for anybody else, again, who's interested in having their lease agreement assessed, reviewed, we can do a thorough review of the rental rates and all the terms of your agreement. And we charge a fee of $1,500 to do that. I think it's reasonable. Most attorneys are going to bill you anywhere from low of $800 to as much as $2,000 to review an agreement. We're going to do this for no cost for the first 5 attendees. So if you call or email me, I'll let you know within the next 24 hours whether or not you're one of the first 5 attendees. And then for anybody else who wants to have their lease reviewed, there's still tremendous value in getting the lease agreement reviewed for a fee to see what kind of changes that we could make to the agreement. And because we've negotiated over 10,000 lease agreements, the one thing that does make us successful, and I should emphasize this, is that we do have access to rental rates. Okay, so if you have had an attorney negotiate your lease agreement, chances are the attorney didn't fully negotiate the rent because they're an attorney. They don't understand the rental rates the way, say, a broker does. If you had a broker negotiate the lease agreement, they may have done a decent job of negotiating the financial part of the lease, but may have not negotiated in the legal terms because they didn't go to law school. So from that perspective, what we try to do at our firm is combine the skill sets and expertise of property managers, landlords, and brokers with lawyers. And we have those skill sets on our staff so that when we're addressing a lease agreement, we're not looking at just 1 or 2 things. We're looking at the lease from both a financial as well as a legal standpoint so that we don't miss out on any critical provisions and also don't put you in a position where you are overpaying in rent going forward. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending the presentation today. And my information is on the screen. So if you have questions, by all means, pick up the phone, call me, or send me an email. And I will do my best to get to all of your questions within the next 24 hours or so. And I'd like to thank everybody. And for those of you that have colleagues that may be negotiating a lease agreement, because this webinar is being recorded, we're going to send you a recorded copy of the webinar within the next 7 business days. So hang tight. You'll get that email to you. And you can share that with your colleagues. You can rewatch the presentation if you found it interesting. And I wish you all the best in negotiation of your lease agreements.